Welcome everyone to the College Prep for Parents and Grandparents, Smart Strategies to Fund Higher Education webinar. This event is sponsored and organized by the Madison Public Library Foundation. My name is Jennifer Hannon. I'm a member of the Foundation's Board of Directors, and I'm happy to welcome you to our event today. Before I welcome our speaker, a couple of housekeeping items. First, the slides shown today will be provided to the participants after the event. And in addition, the recording of this presentation will be available after the event if you'd like to watch it again or share it with somebody you think would benefit from the content. We will save about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation. To the extent you have a question, please use the Q&A feature on your screen. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker, Jamie Hanson. Jamie is a co-founder of Akamai College Consultants and Akamai Investment Advisors. She works to empower families to become informed consumers of higher education. With more than 15 years of experience, her unique knowledge and strategic approach helps individuals save time and money in the college planning process. Jamie is a behavioral financial advisor and a frequent speaker on funding education. Welcome, Jamie.
Thank you, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining us today. College planning is a passion of mine. I enjoy speaking about it, and so I'm happy to be able to have the opportunity to speak to all of you. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. All right. So as Jen mentioned a little bit about me, I am a behavioral financial advisor, and I am from Appleton originally. I actually came to Madison to go to school and loved it so much I decided to stay. My passion for college planning actually became part of my practice back in 2009. I had a lot of clients who had questions about how financial aid worked, how it was the best way to save for college, just a variety of different things. And I realized pretty quickly there were not a lot of resources that were put together for that purpose. So I started becoming educated on the subject myself, and I've been speaking about it ever since and helping families and their students make wise financial choices in regard to college. So as they say, the days are long, but the years are short. The cost for raising a child has absolutely soared since 2000. It's up 40%. And actually just some updated statistics, we are over 300,000 thanks to inflation now. But certainly I think we're all aware that it is expensive to raise a family these days. But then you couple that with there's just not enough going around. 40% of the parents out there are still paying off their own student loans. And 57% of parents have only about $10,000 saved for college. That's not per child, that's actually for all children in the family. So it is difficult to save even with the best intentions, just because we want our kids certainly to have as many opportunities in life as they can. And it does feel like we have so much time to close the gap when they're young. But as we all know, it happens pretty fast. So the cost of college, average annual cost of a four-year in-state public school is now $25,000. When I went to UW-Madison, it was $25,000 for my entire four-year degree. So it is a game changer between now and 2000, which was the year I graduated. So a 90% increase just from 10 years ago, let alone from 20 years ago. And then for private colleges, as you can imagine, they are more expensive. $54,000 is the average cost. And surprisingly, though, those have only gone up about 69 or 70% from 10 years ago. It is the cost of in-state public schools that have actually risen faster than even private schools. And college tuition inflation has averaged 4.63% annually from 2010 to now. And obviously, we're looking at potentially even higher costs because of other inflationary factors, but almost a 5% increase year over year. And that's part of the reason why school has gotten so much more expensive. So when I talk with my families about college, I really do stress finding a right fit college. And for most families, right fit means academic and social, but they're kind of missing that final piece that really makes the difference, and that's the financial piece. And actually only about 8% of the respondents in the Princeton Review's College Hopes and Worries annual survey talk about finances with their kids and are making choices based on what's affordable. They are looking at other things more intently, like degrees that are available, what are their opportunities, what's the prestige of the school. And really the affordability is really what needs to be focused on, because this is going to be a lifestyle changer if they're not doing it in the best way possible. So I thought I'd start out with a little bit of financial aid 101. And this actually answers a lot of questions because if you've ever been to a FAFSA night at a high school, they talk about how to fill out the form, but they don't necessarily talk a lot about what it means. So that's what we'll focus on here today. So this chart is actually from the Princeton Review as well. And when we were talking about financial aid and asking families, how important is it in regard to paying for college, 54% of families said it's extremely important and is the main way that they plan on paying for college. And then there are some families that don't need financial aid at all, but that's only about 2%. So we're talking about 98% of families are going to need to rely on financial aid. Problem is that not all families get financial aid. And so they fall into one of three financial aid categories. So families who will always qualify for need-based aid generally have an adjusted gross income of $100,000 or less, and they have minimal assets. So as far as checking or savings or non-retirement type of accounts. Families who might qualify for need-based aid are those between 100 and 200,000, and they may have some of those non-IRA assets I just mentioned. And families who will not qualify for need-based aid generally are over 250,000. They have significant assets outside of their retirement plans. Although they may not qualify for need-based aid, that does not mean that they won't qualify for merit aid. And merit aid is actually the things that we always try to work towards with our kids. So whether that's academic, that could be artistic, that could be athletic, but those are all the different types of merit aid that are out there. And there's a lot of different schools that will offer merit aid that may not offer very much for need-based aid. So the equation is actually pretty simple when it comes to figuring out need-based aid. And there are a couple of terminology changes that are going to happen here in the very near future. So I will flip back and forth as we go through them. So the equation is the cost of attendance, or COA, minus the student aid index, which used to be called the expected family contribution. That is being changed as we speak. And so you'll see anytime that I mention student aid index, I'll also try to reference it as the expected family contribution for those who are more familiar with that term. Those two things subtracted equal the financial need of a family. So what is counted in the cost of attendance? So there are two types. There's direct costs and indirect costs. And so myself as a planner, I'm always going to focus on the direct costs. Those are going to be things like tuition and fees, housing and meal plans, books and supplies. Those are the things that are going to be paid directly to the school. And then there are the indirect costs that are built in. So travel and transportation, personal expenses, and sometimes health insurance. And if you do plan to have a student go out of state, there is probably a pretty high probability that you will see a bill for probably somewhere in the neighborhood of $2,500 to $3,000 a year for health insurance. Because with the changes that happened over a decade ago with health insurance, we no longer have nationwide plans. And so in order to make sure that the child is protected on campus, they may require you to have health insurance unless you are able to prove that your health insurance would cover them out of state, in which case you can have that removed. But that health insurance bill usually doesn't show up until about a month before they head off to school. And so it can be kind of surprising that suddenly that bill is on top of everything else as well. For travel and transportation and personal expenses, I often actually take them out of the cost of attendance when I'm looking at the affordability of a school, because they are fluff numbers. We have no idea what's going to be specific to each family. For example, UW-Madison builds in about $750 for transportation or travel. Well, obviously, if you live here in Madison, it's not going to cost your student that much to go back and forth to school when they come home to visit. And certainly if they live on either coast, it's going to cost more than $750. And so it is something you still have to plan for, but I don't necessarily build it into the cost of college. We look at different ways to pay for those types of expenses. So as I mentioned before, the student aid index used to be called the expected family contribution. And the reason why they changed that is because the phrase expected family contribution leaves you to believe that that is the amount that your family is going to be expected to contribute to college. But it's actually just the minimum amount a family is expected to pay for college. It will always at least be that, but in most cases, it's going to be more than that. So it caused a lot of confusion. So instead, they just changed it to something very arbitrary like student aid index, which doesn't really tell you much about anything, but certainly doesn't lead to the confusion that was often happening with expected family contribution. It is created by the federal FAFSA, which needs to be filled out each year in order to be able to qualify for any sort of federal student aid. Anything that's offered by the school is different. That's institutional aid. But anything that would be like a Stafford loan or a student loan of any kind, you're going to need to fill out the FAFSA in order to qualify for that at all, regardless if you need need-based aid as a family. So I thought I would put this chart in here too, because there are actually two different ways to come up with that SAI or expected family contribution. There's the FAFSA, which should always be filled out, which is going to work for most public institutions and some private as well. But most private institutions are going to also use something known as the CSS profile. And I call this form the everything in the kitchen sink. So not only do they want to know about your income and your assets, but they want to know about the equity in your home. They want to know about any, what your retirement balances are. And you can see here, I've highlighted the ones in red that the FAFSA does not look at. However, the CSS profile usually does, with the exception of cash value in life insurance. That is not looked at by every school. But you can see at the bottom, the student aid index could be drastically different between the FAFSA at a public school and the CSS profile at a private school. And that is what they are basing your financial aid package on. So to break it down a little bit further, as far as what exactly impacts your student aid index, primarily it's going to be the parent's income. And that's going to be based off the adjusted gross income on the taxes 2 years prior to when the student is going off to school. So for example, if they are headed off to school this fall, 2023, you would have used taxes from 2021 to complete the FAFSA in October of last year. Student income does count, but only if it's over $7,000 a year. So your student is definitely able to work and hopefully save a fair amount of that to help towards school. But it's not a big deal if they're earning, say, 5,000 or 6,000. Generally, they're not even required to file taxes. We still do need to report that amount, but it does not have an impact on their financial aid if it's under that $7,000 number. If it is above that $7,000 number, the amount above will reduce the aid by 50%. This is a big one too. Any money that is given to the student or paid on behalf of the student will reduce the financial aid package by 50%. So this will include at this time distributions from a grandparent or relative owned 529. So we're not talking about the 529s that the parents own. We're talking about a 529 or EdVest account in this state that is owned by somebody else like a grandparent. This also applies to tuition payments that are made directly to the school. So if grandma or grandpa decides to pay $5,000 and they send it to the school, that does need to be reported on the FAFSA and will reduce the financial aid package by 50% of the amount that was gifted. And lastly, any students' assets that are in their name specifically. So that would be checking and savings accounts, possibly savings bonds, but also investment accounts. They're not nearly as popular as they once were. But UTMAs and UGMAs, Unified Transfer to Minors Act, is the long version of that. They are basically investment accounts that are owned by somebody under the age of 18 with a parent basically as the cosigner. If a student does have assets in their name, it will reduce their financial aid package by 20% of the value of that is in that account. So just kind of touching base on that equation again. So we've talked about the cost of attendance minus the student aid index or expected family contribution equals the financial need. So what is financial need? Generally speaking, financial need cannot exceed the student's total aid may not exceed their financial need. So if the cost of the school is $25,000, and the expected family contribution is $10,000, that means the student's need is $15,000. They could not receive a financial aid package for $20,000, as an example. And how much that award is going to be based on that particular school. Very few schools meet 100% of that financial need. In fact, most schools meet 50% or less. So specifically, how do schools meet need? So good stuff is the grants and scholarships. That's what everybody would like to see. That is known as gift aid. It does not need to be paid back. It is free money, and it does actually reduce the cost of the school. However, most schools will build into their financial aid packages loans and work study programs. This is known as self-help aid. So it will make the school seem more attractive because they're giving you a package to cover the cost of the school. However, you are going to need to pay that back. And one thing in particular that is often in those is work study programs. And simply, this is a job that the student can get on campus. And generally speaking, they don't have to pay taxes on the income that they receive. However, it's been pretty few and far between where I've seen students be able to save that money and actually apply it to their next semester's tuition bill. Usually that money is going to go towards, groceries or fund money or something along those lines, because the amount that they can work based on a work study is limited. And so that may only be maybe $500 to $1,000 per semester that they're able to earn. So it may not be in the best idea for the student to take a work study program if they're able to work more than that, or if they need to work more than that, because they will be limited. In my opinion, neither the work study or the loans really reduce the cost of attendance, because like I said, most of the time, the money that the student is earning is not making its way back towards paying for school. Colleges will attempt to fill all or part of a student's need, but again, it will depend on the funds available at each school. And so that's also a difference between public and private. Public schools often do not have large endowment funds, whereas private schools do. And so that is usually why you'll see a larger financial aid package at a private institution. However, their starting price or sticker price is often much higher. So it may not necessarily make the school less expensive than a public school. But I have seen some instances where I can actually send a student to a private school for less than what they'd be able to do in-state tuition for. Now, there are going to be some significant changes coming to financial aid. And so I will do my best to kind of differentiate who this will apply to. So as it stands today, anybody who has a student currently in college or who will be a freshman this fall, the current rules will still apply. If that student graduates before 2024, then anything that I'm talking about doesn't matter. But if you do have young children or grandchildren, this is going to apply for the foreseeable future. This is the first major changes that they've made to this in decades, if ever. And so this is what we'll be going through here. So the biggest change, and will impact several families, and most families actually, is that there will no longer be a discount for multiple children in college. Now, the rumor is that private schools may not follow this rule, and they may still offer that discount to have kids in college at the same time. Does not have to be at the same institution. But for sure, any college that is using the FAFSA, and they are public or in some cases private, but they're only using the FAFSA, they will no longer give a discount to have multiple kids in school at one time. So for example, if your expected family contribution was $40,000, otherwise known as the student aid index, for one child, under normal circumstances this year, that would have been reduced to $20,000 because you would have two kids in school. So $20,000 for each child versus $40,000 for just the one. The discount will go away, and it will be $40,000 for each child. So that is a significant impact to how financial aid is going to be calculated for generations to come. Also, a huge change to parents who are divorced. So as it stands today, whoever is the custodial parent fills out the FAFSA. So generally speaking, that's the parent that the child lives the most with. Even if there's 50-50 custody, there is generally a parent that the student lives more with, and that's generally who would fill out the FAFSA. In a lot of cases, that parent may have less income than the other parent, and therefore their student would qualify for more financial aid. That is going to change. It's now going to be that regardless of 50-50 custody or whoever the child lives with, it is whoever makes more money is this parent that actually needs to fill out the FAFSA. That is a significant change. And it will have a big difference on those families who have significant differences between, say, ex-spouses and whether or not that child is going to get financial aid. I particularly see this being an issue if the family is no longer amicable, because if you're asking a parent who does not want to be involved to give their financial data, I do not see that going well. And so that's a major change and unfortunately a very negative change to this system. So what does this all mean? Basically, the higher the expected family contribution or student aid index is, the less money the student will receive in need-based aid. I am specifically speaking about need-based aid, so incomes of that less than $200,000 mark. These changes will not impact merit-based aid. So I'm going to give a couple of examples just to try to highlight these a little bit more. So again, if the cost of attendance at the school is $40,000 and the student aid index or the amount that you're expected to at least pay is $20,000, your financial aid package you're hoping will at least equal the $20,000. Say a grandparent gives $10,000 towards school or pays it directly to the school. This is the impact that will happen. So the cost of attendance still $40,000. The student aid index has now gone up, which means there is less money for financial aid because we need to report that gift. And so the financial aid package is actually reduced to $15,000. So how do you fix that in today's environment? The alternate would be to give the money to the parent, and then the parent can make that payment on your behalf because there's nothing that needs to be disclosed there. Or as it stands today, you can wait until the grandchild is in the second semester of their junior year, because as you recall, the FAFSA looks back 2 years when it's filling out the information, and that's the time that you would need to actually disclose it, is in the year that you were doing it. So if you no longer need to complete the FAFSA, you no longer need to disclose that. Financial aid impact number 2, cost of attendance, again, using the same numbers. So say that the child does have a $10,000 investment account and we're going to use that money towards tuition. Again, because the account is titled in the student's name. And actually, I should say, irregardless if they're going to use it, just the fact that the account is titled in their name will reduce the package. And so in this case, $40,000, the student aid or expected family contribution went up by $2,000, which equals that 20%. And now the financial aid package is $18,000. So an alternative would be that you can actually take an UTMA and you can change it into a 529 UTMA, and there are no tax consequences for that. That 529 is now considered an asset of the parent and only counts at 5.64% against the financial aid package instead of 20%. That is something that you're going to want to work with a financial advisor or a CPA to do to make sure that you're doing that properly, because if you do not do it properly, it will cause an issue with taxes. Financial aid impact number 3, cost of attendance, again, the same. The question is, grandparent owned 529 or EdVest account for $10,000 and they take money out to pay expenses. The same thing happens as if they gifted the money directly. So it does not matter that it was in a 529 account. The fact that the money was taken out of it and used to pay, at this point in time, they would need to disclose that, and it would reduce their financial aid package. So again, what's a fix for right now? Wait until the second semester of junior year. So there is at least one good change that's coming with these changes for 24 and 25 and going forward, is that the money paid on behalf of the student will no longer impact. So I just talked about an example where it did impact, and that's because anything happening right now or for 2023, 2024 school year is still going to be under the old rules. This does not change until your child or grandchild would go off until 2024, 2025. At that time, any money that is distributed from a relative or grandparent owned 529 will no longer have an adverse impact on their financial aid package, nor would payments made directly to the school reduce their financial aid package. So that's great news. If there is still assets titled in the student's name directly, there are no changes there, and it still has that 20% impact. So again, just to kind of give you an idea for during that 2024-2025 school year and beyond, again, taking the money out of the EdVest account no longer reduces that. and they are still eligible for that $20,000 worth of financial need. So no need to wait until their junior year or figure out different methods to pay for it. That money can be used right away. So people often ask me, what's the best place for saving for college? And there are a number of different ways to save and pros and cons for each. So I just listed a few of them here. I would say that probably my suggestion is always going to be a 529, an EdVest, or Tomorrow Scholar is an option as well. But generally speaking, all of these accounts, because they would be listed in the name of the student, is going to actually adversely impact it. So it would not be my preferred route unless you did not need need-based financial aid. So there are 529s in every state. Specifically in our state, we do have, as I mentioned, the Tomorrow Scholar and the EdVest account. The main difference between the two is whether or not you are paying a commission to a broker to invest that money for you. So I am a financial advisor. I could, in fact, say, let's do a Tomorrow Scholar, and I would get paid 5.75% for every dollar you would be putting into that. To be totally honest with you, financial advisors, unless they specialize in college, are not doing anything fancy with that. And I would not even bother setting up a Tomorrow Scholar plan. I would strictly stick with an EdVest account. They have excellent investment options. They have the age-based. I usually recommend that if your student is approaching, sophomore or junior year of college, I would no longer have that money invested inside of the 529. I would put it in the principal protected fund, which is basically a savings account inside of the EdVest. At this point, there's a greater chance of loss than there would be of gain. So anybody who has a student going off to school this year realizes what 2022 may have done to their EdVest savings, and they wish they would have known that sooner. So that's why, regardless of how well the market is doing, I like to round up all of the wagons and make sure that I know what I'm working with and not take any more chances with that money. So a couple of benefits of the 529 plans. So account distributions are tax-free when they're used for educational purposes. And that terminology of educational purposes has gotten broader. That can be used for room and board, including apartments, as long as the apartment does not exceed the room and board cost at the college. So for example, at UW-Madison, the average room and board cost is about $14,000. So as long as their rent did not exceed that amount, you can use dollars from the 529 to pay for rent. Other examples would be laptops, but an example that it would not be able to be used for would be travel. So you cannot pay for plane tickets, regardless of the fact that your student would be coming back from school. That is not an allowable use at this time. For a 529, like I mentioned before, the impact of financial aid calculations is far less for the money to be inside of a 529 than if it was on the outside and in the student's name. Now, there is no difference between parent savings account and a parent 529 as far as impact of financial aid. They will count the same, but you just get the tax benefits by having it growing inside of a 529 versus, say, for example, a traditional savings account. Often people will ask me about Roth IRAs, and there's a lot of mistakes on Roth IRAs. So if you are the parent and it's your Roth IRA, you are not able to take money out of that Roth IRA to pay for the educational purposes of your child. What you can do is pay for your own if you did have educational costs, and you would not have the 10% penalty. You would still have taxes on any of the gain. If the Roth IRA was in the name of the student, it's not going to count against their financial aid package because retirement accounts are not counted. However, when you took that money out, it would count against them. And also, again, any earnings that were in the account would be taxed and penalized. Sorry, I take that back. It would just be taxed, not penalized, because it would be used for educational purposes. So in order to even fund in order to even fund a Roth IRA, that the student has to have working income. So that's a W-2 or 1099 to prove that they did actually have earned income in that year. So relative and non-relative as the owner, so there's no impact on financial aid. So again, starting in 24-25, if all of the money for college was saved in the name of the grandparent, not only is it not going to be counted at all in the eyes of the FAFSA, but any distributions going forward would also not be counted. So that is going to be a different strategy than what we've been able to do in the past. And I should mention too, when you set up an EdVest account, and generally all 529 plans, you can put a successor owner. So if the grandparent did pass away, it would automatically transfer down to the parent or possibly the other grandparent. And at that time, if it did pass down to the parent, it would have to be counted. Wisconsin state tax deductions. So a question that came through before was in regard to whether or not it made sense to open a 529 in the state where the grandparent lived or in the state where the child resides. So it really depends on whether or not you're looking to get a state tax deduction. So if you live outside of the state of Wisconsin, you are not going to get a Wisconsin state tax deduction by putting money into an EdVest account that's unique to Wisconsin. Now, some states do have that tax deduction available. If it is one of your states, then you'd want to open that account in your state. It does not matter where your child goes or your grandchild goes to school. You're able to use that for any educational purposes. It really comes down to where you open that on whether or not you like the investments inside of that account, and also if you're trying to get a state tax deduction. As I mentioned, anybody can contribute, but the state residents can deduct for their state taxes. The 2023 deductible contribution is $3,860 per student. So if you do have 2 students, you can be putting away and taking a state tax deduction of over $7,200. If you are married, filing separately, or divorced, that amount is reduced per student to $1,930. And that's because they're assuming that the other parent would be contributing as well. So the maximum amount can still only be $3,860 when it comes to the state tax deduction. If you did contribute more than that, say it was a $5,000 contribution, you can carry forward to the next tax year and use that as your state deduction the following year. So it all is not lost. If you do decide to contribute a higher amount, you can just carry that amount forward. And you want to work with your CPA in regard to that. Now, the maximum account balance per student is $545,000. So most people, in fact, none that I've ever run across, have had that much in one student's account, but that is the maximum amount that you can have. No further contributions could be made to that account, but it still can earn additional funds. So one of the questions I get in regard to 529s is, well, what if my student doesn't need it all? What are my options? And there's quite a few options actually. So number one, and it is the one that I would recommend in almost all circumstances, is you are able to transfer that money to another beneficiary, basically anywhere in your family tree, without tax consequences. So it does not have to be another grandchild. You can in fact transfer it back to yourself if you thought you were going to need some higher education yourself. It could be to in-laws. It really could, like I said, anybody really in your family tree, you are able to transfer that money to with having no tax consequences. So any of the money that's in there, once it moves, it will not generate a taxable event. You certainly can cash out the account. And there is a lot of misconception in regard to having it all be taxed. That's actually inaccurate. Whatever your contributions were, those can come out with no taxes. Usually when the distributions are made during educational years, it is going to be a mix of both the contribution and the earnings, so that you are not able to specify that you would like to have contributions not come out. It is going to be a mix, but they usually do a pretty good accounting of what the cost basis versus the earnings in that account are, so that you're able to see exactly what that penalty would be. If you are taking out earnings, then you would be subject to taxes and the 10% penalty for not using it for education purposes. However, there is a big change that just came out with the Secure Act 2.0. This does not start until 2024. Those who do have money left in a 529 are able to convert that over to a Roth IRA. Now, I will have to be specific here because there's a lot of rules, and since it hasn't started yet, there's still some gray area. But what we've been able to decipher is that if it's the parents' 529, but the student is the beneficiary, it needs to be the student's Roth. So the parents cannot take that back unless they made themselves the beneficiary. And then you are not able to make that conversion to the Roth for 15 years. So they don't want people to simply open up 529s who may not be able to contribute to Roths directly and use this as a backdoor strategy to fund one. And so you can see here that 35,000 is the lifetime max rollover, and it cannot be all done at one time. It can only be done based on whatever the Roth annual contribution is, which in this year for somebody under the age of 50 is $6,500. As I mentioned, the account must be opened for 15 years with the same beneficiary. So if you were the parent and you decided to change the beneficiary, it starts that clock over. And then contributions or earnings on those contributions can't be rolled over for 5 years after they've been made. So like I said, they are trying to prevent anybody kind of working through a loophole to fund a Roth as a backdoor solution. So that concludes the presentation. So we'll go through any of the questions that might be in the queue.
Thank you, Jamie. This is great. I personally have a child entering college in 2024, so we're going to be learning all those new rules in the next year or so. We have a few questions from the audience. One is, one I think you already answered regarding if a grandparent lives in another state, where might you want to create that 529? And it sounds like generally it's based on whatever tax result you're trying to achieve.
Yes,
So
that would be good.
Okay, we can skip that one. Next one is, are the CSS profile and the FAFSA both necessary for private schools, or would we complete only one or the other depending on where the student will attend?
Great question. So you always want to complete the FAFSA no matter what, because that's going to be where the student loan comes in if you do need to take out any sort of loan. And then whether or not the private school requires the CSS profile will be based on that school. So you would go to the school's website, look under financial aid, and it would tell you what sort of forms you would need to fill out. They do generally need to be completed at the same time. The CSS profile might have a slightly advanced due date, depending upon whether a student is going early decision or early action.
Okay, thank you. The next question is there a maximum annual contribution? And if grandparents invest, are they only able to do $17,000 as a gift per year, or is any amount tax-free?
So there's actually two different questions here. So I did show in the slide that the maximum amount that could be in a 529 was that $545,000 number. However, when we're talking about federal gifting laws, the most that you can give to an individual without filling out a gift tax form is that $17,000. However, if you talk with your CPA, you'll find that we all have $1 million exclusion, which means that we can give away as much as $1 million. But you have to fill out a form and basically start counting down against that amount. And that again is something that you'd work with your CPA to do, but you can technically gift more than the 17,000. You just have some extra forms you need to fill out, and it would be perfectly acceptable to do that into a 529.
Thank you. Next question, looking at a child graduating in 2025. So if given the choice, is it better to open a 529 by the parent or by a grandparent? And then to fund it, is it better to have the grandparent deposit directly or gift to the parent to fund?
So again, looking at a child graduating in 2025, my strategy, and again, not knowing all of the details, but specific to the which account should we open, I would open it as a grandparent 529. Anybody can fund it. So it doesn't matter if it's the parents' money or the grandparents' money or, the child's money that they earned from working. Any money can go into that account. When they go to file the FAFSA and or the CSS profile, no money that is in that grandparent 529 would be counted. And again, after 2025 and 2024 start of the school year, we no longer have to worry about distributions either. So one of the new strategies that we would be using is probably exclusively grandparent-owned 529s if the student would be eligible for need-based aid.
Okay. Thank you. I don't believe we have any more questions. So I would like to thank everybody for joining us today, and just a couple of items to take away. Again, we are going to be sending out a link to everyone with this presentation and the slides that were provided, so you can have those after the presentation is over. And also now available on our website is our 2022 annual report for the Madison Public Library Foundation. Please check it out and learn more ways in which we're working to build literacy in all forms. Then the foundation is celebrating 30 years this year. In July, we will be, it's Tuesday, July 11th. Mark your calendars between 2 o'clock and 5 o'clock. All of our locations, libraries will be having a birthday celebration with cookies and other festivities. So please join your local library on July 11th at 2 o'clock to enjoy those festivities with us. Thanks again to Jamie and all of you for joining us today. I hope you have a great weekend.